Media Narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:10 p.m. in a very cold, gray, dark, wet, grim, bleak, unwelcoming city of Budapest. And welcome everybody who has joined me. I really appreciate it for the Thursday night live stream. Um, and yeah, the obviously there's a lot of things to discuss. I should just say to start with that today was October the 23rd, and it's a holiday in Hungary because it's the day marking the start of the 1956 Hungarian uprising. It went on for a few days, but October the 23rd was the day on which the uprising started, with the event that triggered it all, which was the reburial of Laszlo Rajk. Laszlo Rajk had been a communist chief. He had been purged, and then there was a show trial in 1948. It was the first of the East European show trials. And following the show trial, Reich was found guilty, obviously, and executed. So the Hungarian government, the communist Hungarian government, trying to placate the, um, the Hungarian public, had decided to rehabilitate Reich and to rebury him. Well, this of course did nothing to placate the Hungarian people, and on the contrary, that reburial launched the events that culminated eventually with the Soviet invasion of Hungary. Anyway, October the 23rd is always commemorated here in Hungary. When I say always, ever since the fall of the communists, and so today there were the two marches in Hungary. The first was the peace march, led by Viktor Orban, who is really not in a great position now for events as you know that has transpired in Washington and in Brussels. And that was followed by a march led by Orban's chief opponent, um, who is Peter Magyar. And that obviously was the the clear suggestion of that march was that the Russians of today are the Russians of 1956, and that if we're going to be against the Russians of 1956, we have to be against the Russians of today. Now, Orban never says that. Orban, on the contrary, he does this whole thing, big speech on October the 23rd, but he uses the occasion to suggest that basically what Hungary was doing in 1956 was rising up against its imperial overlords, and that it was in the tradition of Hungarian yearning for freedom. So, in much the same way that the Hungarians fought against the Ottomans and then fought against the Austrians, the Hungarians fought against the Soviets in 1956. And in that spirit, the Hungarians are today fighting against Brussels. So, Orban just links them all up: the Ottomans, the Austrians, the Soviets, and Brussels. They're all seeking to oppress the Hungarians. So he doesn't say that the Soviets are like the Russians today, because using common sense, he points out that the Russians of today are not doing anything to Hungary. I mean, in what way are the Russians in any way um, oppressing us, interfering in our internal affairs, not doing anything at all detrimental to our interests? Brussels, on the other hand, is. And so that's why he uses this occasion to attack Brussels, but above all now, to attack Brussels for its warlike policy. So that hence today the peace march. And then there was the later in the day the march by Peter Magyar. So the election is set for next April, and who knows how that's going to go. Um, the Magyar had been leading in the polls quite substantially up until recently, but now the polls have tightened, and therefore Orban and Fidesz have a reasonable shot at winning next year's election. So that basically, um, I think if this peace summit had come off, I think Orban would have been a shoe-in, but the peace summit hasn't come off, and so that therefore it's going to be a more problematic for him to win election. He's been there now. Orban's been there now since 2010, 15 years. People are obviously tired, and want to change. But Orban definitely has his core supporters. He has the supporters in the countryside, and of course he has his supporters among the Hungarian diaspora in other countries, above all the Hungarians in Romania, the Hungarians in Slovakia, in Ukraine, and they will vote for Orban. Orban gave them citizenship, and of course they're duly grateful, and therefore they will vote for him. But anyway, that's the background in Hungary. But the real shocker, I guess it's a shocker, but I don't know, was the abrupt reversal of Trump's policy towards Russia, Ukraine, and peace. So, obviously, no one needs reminding that last week, just 7 days ago, we were speaking in very optimistic terms about the possibility of a peace summit to be held here in Budapest between Trump, Putin, and presided over by Viktor Orban. Now, if you recall, what were the events that led up to it? There was the events that led up to it was the phone call between initiated by the Russians, but it was a phone call initiated by Putin. And following following that phone call, Trump announced. It was Trump who made the announcement, not the Russians. The Russians followed Trump. So following the phone call, Trump announced on Truth that he's just had a good call with Putin, and that next week, which is therefore this week, Marco Rubio would lead a U.S. delegation to meet a Russian delegation, obviously led by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And then after that meeting, there would be a summit between Trump and Putin in Budapest. And then the Russians, a couple of hours later, put out their own readout confirming, yes, there would indeed be a meeting. However, they said maybe in Budapest. The maybe suggested that that would still need to be worked out, because obviously Putin's route to Budapest was something that needed to be figured out, because at some point in his journey to Budapest, he would have to cross EU, he would have to cross NATO airspace, and NATO EU airspace, and given the outstanding arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court, there was a a real, maybe it's small, but a real danger nonetheless of Putin's plane being brought down, Putin being abducted and sent to The Hague. And in fact, the Polish foreign minister, the execrable Radek Sikorski, sent out a tweet earlier this week saying just that should Putin's plane cross into Polish airspace, Poland would bring his plane down because Poland was obligated under international law to abide by the rulings of the International Criminal Court. And then somebody said, but not Bibi. No, that's absolutely right. Poland would not execute the arrest warrant against Bibi. And of course, as we saw also last week, Poland would not execute a warrant um, of the German courts. The German courts said that a Ukrainian suspect held in custody in Poland was wanted in Germany in connection with the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline. And Donald Tusk and Radek Sikorski said, no, 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 we're not going to do it. We're not going to hand him over. These people are heroes. And the Polish courts duly ruled that these people were, they were acting in self-defense in blowing up Nord Stream, and therefore we will not execute the German warrant. And of course, the Italian courts did the same thing. So, give me a break. That about international law, and of course, as we've said before, all of this is really just piece of theater on the part of Germany. Germany is not interested at all in uh, bringing to trial these alleged suspects in the Nord Stream bombing. All Germany is trying to do is to provide a face-saving mechanism for the insurance companies, because that's the key here. Because the insurance companies are on the hook for billions and billions of euros for the destruction of these Nord Stream pipelines. The only way the insurance companies can avoid a payout is if it can be shown that this was the product of a terrorist act, because insurance does not cover terrorism. Insurance only covers accident. So that's why it's very important for the German courts to press ahead with these claims that this was a terrorist act, because if they can show, well, hey, this was a terrorist act, then the insurance companies are off the hook. If there isn't, then they have to pay out, and that's why it's so important to say, oh, they're on the hook. But of course, if Germany has to at least show that it's interested in pursuing the perpetrators. That's why it's so important that Germany at least makes a show of, we want to bring to trial these alleged perpetrators, because that way, then the insurance companies can go into the courts and tell the courts, well, hey, we're not going to pay out this money. The pipelines were not insured against terrorism. So that's all. That's the only reason why the Germans are going through this process. And of course, the Poles and the Italians said, "Hey, nothing doing. We're not giving you anything. We're not going to hand anybody over." But in any case, the reversal um, on the part of Trump was quite astonishing, because if you recall, we had the agreement. We're going to hold the summit. Then on Friday, the following day, Zelensky showed up in Washington. He was treated in a very high-handed, disdainful manner by Trump and the administration, and it seemed, at least, that finally Trump was beginning to see that the only way this war can be brought to an end is if Ukraine is just cut off, or just simply say, you have to settle your beef with Russia. You have to accept geography. You have to accept history. This whole NATO expansion and everything was obviously a huge mistake. And that's what it seemed. It seemed as if that's where Trump was going. And then on uh, Tuesday, Tuesday, um, Trump announced that, well, maybe we're not going to have this summit after all, which caught. I mean, we talked about this on Tuesday's live stream. It caused the Russians by surprise, and then the Russians still insisted that, well, we're going ahead with the planning anyway, and Orban also seemed to suggest that, well, we're still going ahead with the with planning for the summit. Then there are all these forces that are arrayed against it. They just want to end this. So that was on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday, Mark Rutte, the a real smoothie, Mark Rutte, um, the NATO Secretary General, came to the White House, and then Trump had a presser with Rutte, and that really pretty much confirmed that this summit has been cancelled. Now it's very significant that Trump has not really offered an explanation as to why he has cancelled it. I mean, what happened? Well, there's nothing whatever has happened in the past. Uh, as then it was 5 6 days to warrant a cancellation. In my podcast yesterday, I pointed out that Lavrov and Marco Rubio had their telephone conversation on Monday, during which Lavrov pretty much told him what the Russian position is, and Lavrov seemed to be under the impression, or at least the Russian side seemed to be under the impression, that the Trump administration, was well aware of what the Russian position is. He said, "Well, we discussed all this at length in Anchorage, Alaska, and it seemed as if you had understood." He said, "But have you understood our position? We spelled it out. We know all their positions. But um, Ukraine cannot be in NATO. Ukraine has to become neutral, has to be non-nuclear, and of course the has demilitarization, denazification, and all of that. That we've said that, and we made clear in Anchorage, Alaska, that there can be no peace in Ukraine until the root causes of this conflict are addressed." And after Anchorage, Trump came away and said, "Yeah, you know what? I think all this talk about ceasefire, that's all. It's all kind of baloney. There has to be a lasting peace." And I think when Trump made that announcement following the Anchorage meeting, then I think the Russians were happy, because they said, "Well, oh, now Trump has understood our position, which is that there can't be a ceasefire until you have addressed the root causes of this conflict." I mean, we're not going back to Minsk. Minsk was just simply a ceasefire, put everything in place, and then after the Zelensky meeting on Friday, and then Trump issued that truth, in which he went back to the demand for a ceasefire in place. Well, everything just stops. If we have a ceasefire, and everyone just accepts this, and then let history decide, whether who won this war and so on. And I think at that moment, I think the Russians seem to think that, well, Trump hasn't really understood. I think they were obviously deluding themselves, that Trump had understood the Russian position in Anchorage, And now Trump was going back, I think, to the NATO Zelensky uh, position, which is, well, let's have a ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire. An unconditional ceasefire means that during the time of the ceasefire, Ukraine will be rearmed, replenished, uh, refinanced in preparation for the next round of fighting. And that's Russia said, well, that's just simply Minsk. And what do we want to do that for? That means we're going to have a war in 5 years' time. Um, so that's why the conversation between Lavrov and and Rubio didn't go particularly well on Monday, and we talked about it yesterday. That from just going by the readouts issued by the two sides, really, there didn't seem to be very much point in the conversation, and I think then. Um, uh, Trump seemed to think, oh well, there's no point in having this meeting. But it's important just to keep in mind that the Russian position has not changed. The Russians are absent insist on the same thing. Um, oh, is it Marty, I always like it when Marty joins us because Marty always introduces some interesting picture. I have to just look at this. What is Marty showing here? The cat. Oh, this is the cat. Oh, this is the I guess the robbery of the Louvre, which is quite extraordinary. I think this is clearly one of the biggest scandals in France in a long time, as incidentally was the fire in the Notre Dame Cathedral, which I think was covered up as to what really happened there. I don't think it had anything to do with electrical wiring and so on. I think they deliberately covered it up because you know there are lots and lots of fires. It's a regular basis of cathedrals in France, and it's nearly always one of France's Muslim immigrants who set fire to France's cathedrals. I think that's what happened in Notre Dame, and I think they covered it up by suggesting that it was electrical wiring. I think there's a cover up going on here because I think there was massive, staggering incompetence. I mean, you don't just rob the Louvre. I mean, just sort of walk away with jewelry at a time when the Louvre was actually open. This wasn't in the middle of the night. This was in the morning when they were actually on other floors. There were visitors to the Louvre. Anyway, we can talk about that in a bit. So that was the the situation, and then you also have to wonder here about the role of Marco Rubio. Rubio is, of course, a very slimy, devious character, feathering his own nest, preparing for his run as a kind of the neocon alternative to Trump. And I think you can say, you know, on issue after issue, Rubio is always making sure that there is no peaceful resolution. Um, and Robert says, "Excellent, Monty. To Catch a Thief is one of my favorites." That's a nice film. It's a nice film, with two charmers, Cary Grant, and of course uh, Grace Kelly. We should show that at some point. On our the Gaggle film night. We got to think of a good theme for it. I mean, we could always have a Hitchcock night, but I think we've already had a Hitchcock night, so we've got to think of some new theme of how to introduce that into our poll. Now, so anyway, after Trump's announcement on Tuesday that now's not the time, um, uh, then he has this news conference with Rutte on Wednesday, and let's just watch a little bit of this news conference. Um, I do this every time. um, and Russia is just absolutely insufferable. And so here are they, here they are yesterday, um, and so yeah, let's watch a bit of this.
Tremendous assets together. So we look forward to that. I think something will work out. We have a very good relationship, but that'll be a big one. We canceled the meeting with President Putin. It didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel like we were going to get to the place we have to get, so I canceled it. But
so he says, "Oh, we canceled the meeting with Putin. I canceled it," but he doesn't really explain. Oh, well, it just didn't feel right. Well, what do you mean it didn't feel right? You make an announcement, which is a big deal. It's a big deal that the president of the United States will, in the very near future, meet with the president of Russia to bring the war to an end. Now he says, "Oh, he didn't feel right." Well, what? I mean, you just got up on the wrong side of the bed this morning.
We'll do it in the future, but next week we'll be with many of you in those locations that I told you. Then it's back to Washington. So thank you very much, everybody. Yeah, please.
Mr. President, can you tell us a little bit about why you're elevating sanctions against Russia right now?
So this is the big development of yesterday. So Trump confirms that there'll be no meeting with Putin in Budapest. And then Scott Bessent, who's always been very hawkish on Russia, and he's been threatening sanctions for some time. And then Scott Bessent announced, well, we will be announcing sanctions against Russia. And so these are really the first new sanctions that Trump has announced. Trump has, of course, continued with the Biden sanctions, but he hasn't introduced any new sanctions of his own until yesterday. And so what they did was they sanctioned two Russian major oil companies, which is Lukoil and Rosneft. And that's a significant. We don't yet know what the outcome will be, but that is significant because what a sanction means is that it hits all companies that do any business with Lukoil and Rosneft. And of course, it hits the companies in India and China that do business with Lukoil and Rosneft. And in particular, it hits the Indian refiners. And of course, they the Indian refiners, that if they're facing U.S. sanctions, then they have to make a decision as to is that what they want to do, whether they want to go on doing business with Russia, or and live with the sanctions, or do they prefer to maintain their status in the U.S. market? So it's it could, we don't yet know, but it could be a significant blow to Russia. So that was the announcement. We're going to hit Lukoil and Rosneft. And now, keep in mind, Trump up until now had been saying that he really wants to, not touch sanctions against Russia, because he thinks that somehow if we go down the path of sanctions, then essentially we no longer have any leverage with the Russians, and then that's and then we're not going to be able to bring peace. And so he's kept saying no to sanctions, even though he's come under some pressure, and particularly from the horrible Lindsey Graham, who's been threatening with those 300% tariffs on all Chinese and Indian goods until because they do business with Russia. So Trump has kind of said no to this up until now. So he chooses to do this now, just 7 days after he announces that he's going to have a peace summit with Putin. So Putin had done nothing. Nothing. The Russians had done nothing at all to upset Trump, to upset the United States, nothing whatsoever. So he's now gone from urging this peace summit to essentially now reversing even his own policy on sanctions and said, "Oh yeah, we're now going to hit Russia with sanctions." A complete reversal of policy without any real explanation as to why has he made this change.
I just felt it was time. We've waited a long time. I thought that we'd go long before the Middle East. And Mark, as you know, we did the Middle East plus seven. So we did seven different wars from Pakistan and India to so many,
Azerbaijan, Armenia,
which they said was impossible to do. All these wars I did, and the one that we have left, we have one left. It'll be nine. We have one left, and I think we'll get that done too. I think we're on our way to getting it done.
we have to.
Please.
Mr. President, do you have a timeline for when you think this war is going to be over because of your
No, I don't
leadership?
have a timeline. You can't have in war. It's hard to have a timeline. You know, so many things happen in war. Go ahead.
What about Tomahawk missiles? Putin is definitely
Well,
afraid.
the problem with the Tomahawk that a lot of people don't know, it'll take
All
a
right.
minimum.
Now, so now the question is about, well, what about the tomahawks? Now, this is, of course, it itself is a reflection of Trump's peculiar style of policymaking. Because you remember, the Zelensky had been asking for these tomahawks for a long time. He was asking for tomahawks in the Biden era, and Biden had said no to the tomahawks. And Trump also had been saying no to the tomahawks. And then a couple of weeks ago, particularly when he was on his way to Israel, he said, "You know what? Maybe it's not such a bad idea. I think I'll mention it to Vladimir. What does he think about it?" And so that was the he suddenly put that on the table that he was going to give Zelensky the tomahawks. And then, of course, Zelensky was scheduled to arrive last Friday, and everyone thought that's it. They're going to sign the deal for the tomahawks. And then during that Friday meeting, you'll recall, Trump said, "No, we're not going to. The tomahawks are a dangerous escalation." So, and that was again in the spirit of, okay, well now no tomahawks, dangerous escalation, and we've got the peace summit with Putin coming up. So that was the thrust, and now he's being asked very reasonably, well, what about the tomahawks? And the reason he's being asked about these tomahawks is that Trump's kind of changes of mind are legion. So just because he said last Friday, "Oh, we're not going to give the tomahawks," it doesn't mean anything. Zelensky today was in Brussels, and naturally, the questions that he was peppered with was, "Well, what about the tomahawks? When are you going to get the tomahawks? Are you ready for the tomahawks?" and, and then yesterday at this presser with Zelensky, with Rutte, he says no to the tomahawks. He's still sticking to the line that, for what it's worth, that the tomahawks are dangerously escalating. And now he kind of blurts out what we know and we've always known, which is there is no way at all Ukraine can use the tomahawks without the Americans doing it for them. And everyone knew this, that all this is complete nonsense. That, we want tomahawk, we want the tomahawk, we want the tomahawks. And then Trump admits here, there is no way Ukraine can use the tomahawks unless the Americans do it for them. And Trump here admits this.
6 months, usually a year, to learn how to use them. They're highly complex. So the only way a tomahawk is going to be shot is if we shot it, and we're not going to do that. But
the only way the tomahawk can be shot is if we shot it, and we're not going to do that. Well, that's what he says now. Who knows what he's going to say tomorrow? And anyway, he goes on here
with a tomahawk. It's a very powerful weapon, very accurate weapon, and maybe that's what makes it so complex. But it will take a year. It takes a year of intense training to learn how to use it, and we know how to use it, and we're not going to be teaching other people. It will be it's too far out into the future.
Yes, Mr. President, I saw, Mr. President, that you said as recently as yesterday that you still believe that Putin wants to end the war.
Yeah,
Then
I
today
do.
you took this step to ratchet the sanctions and put more
Yeah.
pressure on him. What else are you going to do to encourage him to get there, or can you explain why you do believe that he wants peace?
Yeah, it's a good question. Today is a very big day in terms of what we're doing. Look, these are tremendous sanctions. These are very big. Those are against their two big oil companies, and we hope that they won't be on for long. We hope that the war will be settled. We just answered having to do with the various forms of missiles and everything else that we're looking at, but we don't think that's going to be necessary. We would like to see them just take the line that has been formed over quite a long period of time and go and let's go home. Last week they had almost 8,000 soldiers killed. Many Russians were killed last week. Many Ukrainians were killed last week. We think it's ridiculous, and would like to have it end.
Why do you think he wants peace, though? Why do you still believe that?
I think they want peace. I think they both want peace at this point. It's been, it's almost 4 years. You're going into 4 years, and if I were president, it never would have started. But yeah, it's time.
Now he reverts back to this trope. Well, if I were president, this war would never have started, which may or may not be true. But let's say it is true, and the Russians have said, whether they want to ingratiate themselves with him or not, they've said, yeah, we also think that had Trump been president in 2022, the war would never have started. But where does that get us? That's that's a coulda, woulda, shoulda thesis. He is president now, and he's got a limited amount of time at his disposal to end this. Basically, it's already going to be soon 10 months that he has been president, and what has he done to end this? And by embracing this policy of sanctions, he has now embraced not just the Biden policy, he has embraced the NATO policy, he has embraced the EU policy, he has embraced the Kaya Kallas policy. In other words, he is now Kaya Kallas, which means you keep doing this thing, you keep imposing these sanctions without any expectation that the sanctions will do anything. Because, it may well be that this sanctions package will hurt the Russians. It will be that. I mean, I don't think it's one should just simply say, oh, it's not going to affect the Russians. It may well help affect the Russians, but that isn't going to change Russian policy. The Russians are not going to, back down and say, that's it, we're going to end this war because of these sanctions. That just isn't going to happen. That's not who the Russians are. It's not who anybody is. Nobody backs down in the face of sanctions. There's certainly no great power is going to back down in the face of sanctions. So all that has been done here is essentially Trump has embraced the very policy that he has said is unlikely to work. And that's what's so astonishing. So, oh yeah, we'll do the sanctions. Why? Because maybe that's going to bring Putin to the negotiating table. Thank you, Kaya Kallas. Anyway, let's go on with this with the press.
Mr. President, on the shutdown, do you plan to meet with Democrats before you head to Asia? And if not, why not meet with Democrats?
Well, I think it's a shame that it's shut down because we have the greatest economy, as you were saying before.
Right. So that was then there was a very interesting question posed to Trump, but in fact more to Rutte by Liam Cosgrove, and I'm not exactly sure who Liam Cosgrove is. I think he's somebody. Maybe I'm wrong. I think he's somebody who used to be at the Telegraph. But anyway, he asked a very pointed question, and I think it's what is interesting was that he made Trump very uncomfortable. So let's watch Liam Cosgrove. Wait, okay, let's.
He can have a big influence, and we will certainly be talking about Russia, Ukraine.
Mr. President,
In the back.
Thank you, Mr. President. Liam Cosgrove is here. My question is actually for the Secretary General.
Yes.
Mr. Secretary, I don't know if you've seen this, but polling out of Ukraine shows a massive collapse in Ukrainian support for the war. The Gaggle poll had just 23%. That's less than a quarter. Zelensky came out today praising President Trump's proposal for freezing the front lines of battle as part of a ceasefire. He said that's a good compromise. So people view your coming here as, you're lobbying the U.S. government to continue its involvement in the war. You're obviously lobbying for more NATO weapons to be sent to Ukraine, but Ukrainians themselves don't want to fight the war. So how do you justify that morally?
Well, now what? Now this question is a really pointed question. You never get questions such as this at any of these presses, because what he's saying here is that, well, Zelensky is not really a representative of the Ukrainian people. He's he doesn't say it, but the implication is that Zelensky is essentially a dictator. You are fueling a war led by a dictator. He's cancelled elections. He's not accountable to the people of Ukraine, and the people of Ukraine want this war to come to an end. And instead, you're fueling this war, irrespective of what the Ukrainian people themselves actually feel. So there's no support for this war in Ukraine. Instead, you want more and more arms to continue to fuel this war. For what purpose? Just to kill more Ukrainians, kill more Russians. Now, this is the reason why this is a pointed question, was that, of course, that question can be very much directed at Trump himself. You were the one who ran on the platform of bringing this war to an end, bringing this destruction to an end. Instead, you are helping to fuel it. Now, as you'll see, Rutte, of course, does this smarmy, familiar NATO routine of pretending that the more arms you send, the more you fuel a war, the closer you are to bringing peace. That somehow, when you send arms somewhere, you're actually helping peace. Like, as somebody wrote a book called Bombs for Peace. That's the mentality of NATO. Well, we're interested in peace. So dishonest, so slimy, so disgustingly propagandistic is NATO that this is the way they talk. Oh, we just want peace. Yeah, we're sending arms in order to bring peace. Anyway, so listen to Rotte's disgusting reply, but then watch what Trump does.
Only for one thing, and that is to make sure that we end this war. And I don't have to lobby the president, because we totally agree on this. And this is what he has been doing from day one. Everything he could do to break the deadlock with Putin, get a dialogue going, dialoguing also with Zelensky, and getting this war done. It's crucial. And the fact that the US is now supplying weapons into Ukraine, paid for by allies, is extremely important. And that's now happening since...
Now, what you can see, Trump is getting very uncomfortable, because Trump can always fob off all these, liberals, the cruise missile left types, and why aren't you doing more to support Ukraine? Why aren't you doing more to hurt Putin? Why aren't you taking the side of Zelensky against Putin? Why aren't you doing more for NATO? And he can handle those kinds of questions with ease. But this is a question that's very pointed. Why are you fueling a war? You said you were going to bring this war to an end. Instead, you're doing the opposite. So
2-3 months, about 2 billion moving into Ukraine.
The war hasn't wind down. Why do you think that'll wind it down now?
What do you mean?
You think more weapons will wind down the war?
No, I mean, there's
you think more weapons will wind down a war? Nobody asks such questions. I mean, it's kind of amazing that here at the Oval Office, never at NATO headquarters, never with any journalists. But do you think more weapons will wind down a war? Is that the way to end a war? Sending in more weapons? And you just watch how uncomfortable Trump is getting with this line of questioning.
There's more to be done. So what you need, what the president said this weekend, stop where you are. So basically do a ceasefire and then have all your discussions about territory and whatever. But first stop the war. This is what you said on Friday and on Sunday.
It's a war. I mean, your question's really a fair one. It's a war that should have never started.
And
And you know how I feel about
And now
it.
it has
But
to
it's
be
a war that should have never started. And we're not selling any weapons to Ukraine. We're selling them to NATO, which is different from before. With Biden, he just gave $350 billion worth of weapons and cash right into Ukraine, and that was so foolish. But we sell them to NATO, and in theory, you can do what you want with them. It doesn't have to be Ukraine, but probably it is mostly.
No, what nations are doing.
So notice what Trump has done here. He has not answered the question. He reverts to his familiar talking point one, which is, well, this war would never have started if I had been president, which had nothing to do with the question that was asked. And then talking point number two was that, well, we're not really giving these weapons to Ukraine, we're selling them to NATO, and then NATO can do whatever it wants with them. Yeah, so we're not really giving to Ukraine; they can do whatever they want with them, even though we know exactly what they're going to do with them. So this is that's a total non-answer to the question. Oh well, they can do whatever they want with them. We're not paying for it, so we just don't know. We're just like we're in a shop. We're just selling goods here. We sell a loaf of bread, a pastry, and then people can do whatever they want with them. They can make toast, or they can make bread pudding or whatever. That's all. We just, it's nothing to do with us. So thoroughly disingenuous answer here. And then, of course, the the interesting thing here, well, he does this, and now the question is, well, how would the Russians respond to this? Because the Russians had, up until now, had been very, very positive about Trump. So they absolutely would never criticize the Trump administration. Trying to separate the Europeans from the Americans. I think that's a fatuous exercise. It always was a fatuous exercise. I think the Americans and the Europeans are joined at the hip. The Americans have no intention of leaving NATO. NATO is the mechanism whereby the Americans assert their dominance over the world, and the Europeans have no interest whatever in looking after their security by themselves. They don't have the resources for it. They need the Americans, so it's never going to happen. The Soviet Union tried to separate the Americans and the Europeans. The Soviet Union failed, and the Russians are also trying to do this. It is going to fail. That is just it isn't going to happen. But anyway, the Russians did indeed respond, and but obviously not at all happy about this. And so the first out of the gate was the Zaharova, and she gave the news conference today, and she said that we would like to confirm Russian Federation consistently believes that there is no alternative to achieving the goals of the special military operation, including reliably ensuring Ukraine's neutral, non-aligned, and nuclear-free status. Its demilitarization, denazification, the development of reliable guarantees for the rights and freedoms of Russian-speaking population, the unimpeded functioning um, of um, of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. This is the starting point in our dialogue with the United States as well as other interested countries. And then she says, I also cannot help but comment on the news about the decision announced by the Treasury Department to introduce unilateral restrictive measures against Russian oil companies Rosneft and Lukoil under the pretext of the alleged insufficient commitment of the Russian side to a peaceful settlement in Ukraine. We view this step as entirely counterproductive, including in terms of signaling the need for a meaningful negotiating solution to the Ukrainian conflict. If the current US administration follows the example of its predecessors, who attempted to coerce or force Russia into compromising its national interests through unlawful sanctions, the results will be exactly the same, disastrous from a domestic political perspective and detrimental to global economic stability. However, this will not pose any particular problems for us. Our country has developed strong immunity to Western restrictions and will continue to confidently develop its economic potential, including its energy sector. So, as you can see, clearly the Russians are now striking a different tone toward Trump. I mean, they're disappointed. They're disappointed, obviously, in the abrupt cancellation of the Budapest summit without any real explanation as to why Trump did this. And now the sanctions regime, which is obviously an economic blow. The Russians will withstand it, but it is an economic blow, and and essentially all the hopes that they had entertained naively, without question, for an improvement in U.S. Russian relations or U.S. Russian cooperation. Remember, this time last week, we were talking about Dmitriev, this hedge fund guru who works for Putin. You know, his plan for an Alaska Russia tunnel. They're going to build a tunnel. And lo and behold, no tunnel. In fact, no cooperation at all. Anyway, so that was Zaharova earlier in the day. And then Putin himself weighed in at some length. So here is following this meeting with the Russian Geographical Society. He answered media questions. And so here, question. Yesterday, we heard another statement from the US president regarding a meeting with you, or perhaps not, regarding the Ukrainian crisis. Almost simultaneously, US sanctions were imposed against Russian oil companies. Today, the European Union introduced further anti Russian sanctions. Toilets, monetized toys, puzzles, and tricycles are now banned. How can you comment on all this? And so then Putin says, well, the fact that they cancel the purchase of our toilets will cost them dearly. It seems to me that they would actually need them in the current situation if they continue the same policy towards the Russian Federation. So, Putin using a little bit of a scatological humor about the toilet. And then he goes, regarding the statements made by the President of the United States, what can I say? In our last telephone conversation, so that's the conversation of Thursday afternoon, both the meeting itself and its location were proposed by the American side, and I agreed with this, expressed my thoughts on the matter, and said that, of course, such meetings need to be well prepared. It would be a mistake for both me and the American president to approach this lightly and leave the meeting without the expected result. And then it must be said that the US president agreed with this, fully agreed, and said that a number of officials from the US administration would be working on their side to prepare for this meeting. He named some of them, and I said that after our American colleague had determined the final list of those who would work on preparing for our meeting, we, for our part, would also announce who would be working on our side. But initially, without doubt, the first steps in this direction should be taken by Lavrov and Rubio. That was the decision. So that was during the phone conversation. Remember, that was a 2.5 hour long phone call. So that's a very long conversation. Now, regarding the new sanctions, first, there's nothing new here. Yes, they are serious for us. Of course, that's clear, and they will have certain consequences, but they won't have a significant impact on our economic well being. And then he said, we remember the first term, Trump imposed the largest number of sanctions ever imposed against the Russian Federation. Those sanctions currently have two aspects, a purely political one and an economic one. And then, as for the political aspect, what are we talking about here? This is, of course, an attempt to put pressure on Russia, but no self respecting country or people ever makes a decision under pressure. And of course, Russia has the privilege of feeling and considering itself among this list of self respecting countries and peoples. That's the first thing. Now, that's a very important point that he's making here, which is, he's not saying, oh, that's not going to have any impact on us. He said, yeah, it'll have an impact, adverse impact on us. But Russia, like any other self respecting country, isn't going to change its policy as a consequence of pressure. The idea that we're going to cave, we're going to come to the negotiating table and we're going to agree to Trump's terms to freeze the conflict, it's not going to happen. We've set out our position. We set out our position to Trump on a number of occasions. It's a problem for the American side if they're not listening to us. And I think the Russians thought that Trump had listened to them in Anchorage, Alaska, but they thought he was listening during the conversation last Thursday. But instead, they're saying, "Well, we're going to apply pressure." But this is mindless. It's absolutely mindless. This is Kaya Kallas level of thinking on the part of Trump. That somehow Russia, a great power, obviously not the equal of the United States, but nonetheless a great power, is going to cave because of sanctions pressure. I mean, it's nuts. I mean, that's why, you have to be a complete idiot, the Kaya Kallas type person to believe that. And Trump doesn't think that. So he has now embraced a policy that he himself said was stupid. Anyway, let's go on for a little bit with that. And then he says the second is a purely economic component. But if we're talking about the political aspect, then of course this is an unfriendly act towards Russia. So this is significant. He uses this term, an unfriendly act towards Russia. They've never used this kind of language with Trump before. They never said anything negative about him. This is an unfriendly act toward Russia. That's obvious, and it doesn't strengthen Russian-American relations, which were only just beginning to recover. Of course, with such actions, the U.S. administration is damaging Russian-American relations. Regarding the economic aspect, I repeat, of course, there's nothing good or pleasant about it. But if we look objectively and professionally at the economic side of these sanctions, what do we see? And then here he goes into some economic argument, because let's just remember the point about these sanctions and why there is a serious aspect to them is that it punishes third parties. It punishes the companies that do business with Lukoil and Rosneft. And that means primarily the refiners, Indian refiners, but in particular, and then of course trading companies insurance companies, shipping companies, anyone who actually handles oil from these two Russian oil companies are then liable for these Russian sanctions. So therefore, each of these companies are going to have to make a decision as to whether they want to risk being punished by the Americans, or they would rather just simply wash their hands of this and try and do business somewhere else. So that's the point about these uh, sanctions. Um, anyway, so then Putin goes on here. He says U.S. produces 13.5 million of barrels of oil per day. Saudi Arabia 10 million. Russian Federation 9.5 million. But the U.S. consumes 20 million. They sell some and buy even more, mainly from Canada. So 13.5 million are produced, 20 million are consumed. But the Russian Federation and Saudi Arabia sell more oil and petroleum products. Anyway, the Saudi Arabia sells about 9 million tons of oil and petroleum products to foreign market, while the Russian Federation sells 7.5 million. In other words, our contribution to the global energy balance is very significant. And now this balance has been created in the interests of both consumers and producers. Disrupting this balance is a very thankless task, including for those trying to do it. So it's kind of saying that, well, what Trump is doing is creating instability in the global energy markets. So they're going to hurt Russia, but they're going to hurt everybody else. And you've seen an oil price spike today as a result of the sanctions announcement yesterday. And then it must be said that overall production is currently at a standstill. Of course, it's possible to replace some, certainly not all, of Russian oil and petroleum products on the global market. But this takes time and it requires significant investment. For the first time, we recently heard from the International Energy Agency that it is proposing and encouraging economic participants to invest in hydrocarbon energy. So anyway, then it goes on. So a sharp increase right now doesn't seem possible. And if the supply of our oil and petroleum products on the global markets were to sharply decrease, prices would rise, obviously, as my American colleague and I discussed. What would this lead to? It would lead to a sharp increase in the cost of oil and petroleum products, including at gas stations, and the United States is no exception. And given the domestic political calendar of the United States, it's clear how sensitive some processes will be in this regard. And those who are pushing the current US administration to make such decisions, we need to understand who they're working for. But that's not important. What's important to us is that we feel confident, stable, and despite certain issues, our energy is nevertheless quite stable. So it's kind of saying the Americans may well hurt themselves more than they hurt anybody else by this policy. I hope this won't lead to major changes in the global market. If we ultimately move beyond pressure and instead move towards serious long-term discussion, we have many areas of joint work. We are generally prepared for this, but as we see, this depends not only on the Russian Federation, but on our partners, including the Americans. And then he's asked about the long-range weapons. And so regarding the use of Western long-range weapons, how do you personally assess the apparently contradictory signals coming from Washington? The day before, the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal reported that the US had lifted a key restriction on the use of these weapons. Then Trump stated that Tomahawks would not be supplied after all. And just an hour ago, Zelensky again said that Ukraine would receive weapons with a range of almost 3,000 kilometers. In your opinion, is this still an escalation? And then Putin says this is an attempt at escalation, but if such weapons are used to strike Russian territory, the response will be very serious, if not overwhelming. Let them think about it. So obviously that's quite a serious threat. And this is, of course, very significant because if indeed there's now going to be a total collapse of Russian-U.S. relations, and this could well happen. I mean, Trump has now embarked on a course of action that he had said he wasn't going to do, and this could lead to a very rapid deterioration in Russian-U.S. relations, and there may well be a a quite significant retaliation from the Russians. Now, what this question referred to was very interesting because it referred to an article in the Wall Street Journal that said that Trump had withdrawn the any restrictions on Ukraine's use of long range weapons. Now that's a significant step also because remember, Biden administration had given the go ahead for the use of the ATACMS on Russian territory, hitting deep inside Russian territory. Trump had condemned that decision and said, "Well, that's needlessly escalatory." And early on in the administration, they basically had told Ukraine not to use these ATACMS to strike deep inside Russia, and now it seems that that policy has changed. And so let's just take a look at this Wall Street Journal article, which incidentally Trump criticized, but didn't exactly deny the content of the article. So here you can see the headline: U.S. lifts key restriction on Ukraine's use of European long-range missiles. And then it says, move coincides with a Trump push to pressure Moscow into talks on ending the war and to withhold U.S. Tomahawk missiles from Kiev. So sanctions plus lifting restriction, that sounds awfully like the Biden policy. So Trump was like, well, the war wouldn't have happened if I were president. So then why are you pursuing Biden's policies? So that's the Wall Street Journal article. And then Trump kind of said, oh no, the Wall Street Journal story of U.S. approval of Ukraine being allowed to use long-range missiles deep into Russia is fake news. Okay? What's fake? He says the U.S. has nothing to do with those missiles. What the hell does that mean? What do you mean the U.S. has nothing to do with those missiles? Because even when it comes to the Storm Shadow missiles, the ones that have been prepared by that were provided to Ukraine by the British, the Storm Shadow, they cannot be used without the American approval. The Americans have to sign off on the use of the Storm Shadow. You know, you'll recall when Keir Starmer came to Washington asking for approval of the use of these Storm Shadows. That was still in the Biden era, and Biden didn't seem to want to give his approval. So Storm Shadows cannot be used without the Americans signing off on it. And the Storm Shadow was used 2 days ago to hit a chemical plant inside Russia. That was the Storm Shadow. That was Ukraine said, we use the Storm Shadow. And we know the Storm Shadow cannot be used without the United States signing off on it. So Trump said, oh, the U.S. has nothing to do with those missiles. Untrue. Wherever they may have come from, or what Ukraine does with them. This is totally disingenuous. I mean, it's all connected with the United States. The United States has to sign off on it, and the targeting information, all of the targeting information is provided by the United States. And we've had a number of stories saying Trump continues to provide satellite information to Ukraine to hit targets inside Russia. And then so this is the Wall Street Journal story. The Trump administration has lifted a key restriction on Ukraine's use of long-range missiles provided by Western allies, enabling Kiev to step up attacks on targets inside Russia and increase pressure on the Kremlin. Ukraine used a British-supplied Storm Shadow cruise missile on Tuesday to strike a Russian plant in Bryansk that produced explosives and rocket fuel. And then it says the unannounced U.S. move to enable Kiev to use the missiles in Russia comes after authority for supporting such attacks was recently transferred from Pete Hegseth at the Pentagon to the top U.S. general in Europe, General Alexis Grinkevich. And then the shift coincided with a push in early October by President Trump to pressure the Kremlin into talks on ending the war, including the possibility that he would approve the Tomahawks. And then, however, U.S. officials said they expect Ukraine to conduct more cross border attacks using the Storm Shadow, which is launched from Ukrainian aircraft and can travel more than 180 miles. The U.S. can restrict Ukraine's use of Storm Shadow because the missiles use American targeting data. That's the key. Um, and then in a statement, the White House official said, this is a war that never would have happened had President Trump been president, something President Putin himself acknowledged, and President Trump is trying to get it stopped. The president also negotiated a historic agreement to allow NATO allies to purchase American-made weapons. So, the familiar boilerplate not answering the real question, which is that Trump has now signed off on essentially the use of these long-range missiles um, inside Ukraine that require American satellite data. And Trump doesn't, as always with Trump, there's a lot of hot air, but that truth that he sent out was in no way a denial of the story in the Wall Street Journal. Anyway, let's take a look now at our the Gaggle locals board page. These are Gagglers, the people who make this Gaggles community possible, because they maintain the dogs in the life that they're accustomed, because the dogs do all the hard work. They do all the heavy lifting, and then the dogs start complaining. Their work is unremunerated. They're not appreciated. No one loves them. No one respects them. These familiar complaints that they direct at me, and so I have to, give my feeble responses. So anyway, thank you so much to Gagglers for their contributions. And the first question, or the first comment, is from Summer Petrus, who's coming to Budapest very shortly. We're going to meet in a few days. So Summer Petrus says, this morning was a bright, clear, golden October day here in Budapest. Yeah, in the morning, and then it started drizzling and getting cold and extremely unpleasant. And then, but Summer Petrus goes on, but wait, I see a dark patch of gloom and murk with associated rain cloud. Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. That must be the 8th district of Budapest where George resides. I don't think it was the 8th, because I walked around today. I was observing these peace marches, and I was on Andrássy út watching the march of this Peter Magyar, the anti-Orban march, and it was raining quite heavily. So that was not the 8th district. But anyway, thanks for pointing this out. Then Robert, always very good to see you. You got the big elections that are coming up. I guess it's not next Tuesday; it's the Tuesday after. So you need to keep us informed as to what's going on in New Jersey. Looks like the New York mayor's race. I think that's a kind of a done deal, but I guess New Jersey is still up in the air. Anyway, Robert asks, could one interpret Trump's hesitation on Ukraine as a Hamlet moment? Hamlet, okay. On the campaign trail, there was just one room to play to, the crowd. Now there are many rooms he's trying to play to, each with its own conflicting agenda. Well, that's an interesting way of looking at it. The problem is that the other, he talks, that thing that he does with the crowd, that just is on the level of rhetoric. It never really gets very far. And so, in practical terms, which side gets what he wants, and it's the side that wants war. Yes, I would credit that Trump has changed the rhetoric of Washington, but in a way, but in a superficial sort of way. Yes, he no longer he doesn't do the demonization of Putin. He doesn't demonize Russia. He's in fact, at times he's quite respectful towards Russia. At times he's actually very nasty, disdainful, discourteous towards Russia. But nonetheless, he's abandoned the whole rhetoric of Russia as the evil empire, which Biden was engaged in. However, that hasn't led to any change in any significant change in policy. He's more or less kept the Biden policy in place, and now he's kind of escalated, his own involvement in it. So up until yesterday, he's essentially kept things on a kind of just maintain the status quo, keep everything that Biden did, despite all of his condemnations of Biden. He hasn't altered the Biden policy, except rhetorically. But now, I mean, he really is in essentially embracing this NATO line. He's I think escalated, and it's going to be very difficult for him to come back on it. Now, it's interesting that he still wants to go back to his the Trump, the peacemaker, the Trump, the man who's going to bring this war to an end. Trump was the opponent of endless wars. He still wants to maintain that view. We saw that in that presser when that guy, that Liam Cosgrove, who asked that very pointed question, Trump immediately jumped in and said, yeah, I kind of agree with you. You're making a very good point here. But then, his response was just simply to, repeat his familiar talking points about, oh, it wouldn't have happened, if I'd been president, and so on. And even these sanctions, he announced the sanctions during that presser, but it's very interesting that when he sent the truth out about the sanctions, he essentially sent out the press release issued by the Treasury, almost as if, well, this is the Treasury policy. It has nothing to do with me. It's the Treasury that's pursuing the policy. Just like this truth that I just quoted from about the Wall Street Journal, that Trump has signed off on the deep strikes inside Russia, said, "Oh, this is just fake news," even though he hasn't shown at all that there's anything fake about it. So he still wants to maintain his role as this as the peacemaker, but it's coming to mean less and less. And just simply, if he comes out, let's say he comes out tomorrow and says, you know what, I think I do want to have a meeting with Putin. It's not. It doesn't mean anything. I mean, it's just something. Okay, you say all this, you get a little bit of media attention, but ultimately, you haven't altered the policy, and therefore you're not really moving towards peace. And I think that's what really is really significant about the maneuvers of the last 7 days, is that Trump isn't really moving towards peace. I mean, the way to move towards peace would be, to come up with a peace plan. He could come up with a peace plan. And there was talk earlier on. Trump wanted the Russians to present their peace proposal, and the Ukrainians to present their peace proposal. But of course, they were so far apart that there was no way that there could be any kind of a meeting ground. But then it would be up to Trump to outline how he envisages the final outcome. What would he think as a reasonable outcome? He doesn't want to do that. If he doesn't want to do that, then just simply swatting Zelensky one day and then swatting Putin the next day and then going back to swatting Zelensky on the third day, that's not getting anywhere. I mean, that just that's just a way of, oh well, I'm going to try and keep a foot in both camps, but he's increasingly not going to be able to do it. I think basically, I think he's losing the support of the peace camp, because they say, well, he hasn't really done anything to bring this war to an end, and just saying one thing one day and then the opposite the next, that doesn't really get us anywhere. And so that's why ultimately it doesn't get us anywhere. And by not getting us anywhere, it means that the old policy, the Biden policy, just goes grinding inexorably onwards, and then NATO is purring. Rutte always gives this impression of he's purring, that they're getting what they wanted. They're getting Trump to send weapons. And if Trump wants to tell the public, oh, well, but we're not paying for it, NATO's paying for it, and if that keeps Trump happy, Rutte is happy to go along with it. Yeah, sure. Yeah, we're paying for everything. Of course, NATO's not paying for it. Of course, the Americans are paying for it. I mean, it's just nonsense. America lends the money, and then the Europeans, they pay for it. But no, of course, the Americans are paying for it. But if Trump wants to tell the people that it's the Europeans are paying for it, well, fine. Rutte is quite amenable. He's going to play along with Trump. But so that's the NATO Kaya Kallas policy continues inexorably forward. That's why they're all celebrating today. That the EU announces its 19th round of sanctions, and NATO, continues on its way, and then the Americans announce their sanctions. So everyone is happy, and everyone's got the war that they wanted. Anyway, thank you, Robert, and then Marty says movie night theme, the French Resistance. That's quite interesting. What we could also do, if we have the French Resistance, we could show Marcel Ophus's film, The Sorrow and the Pity, which kind of undermine the whole story of the Resistance, because the theme of the film is that the French and the Germans kind of gone on quite well. It caused great consternation when that film came out, I think in 1969. The French really didn't like it, but it's now regarded as as one of the one of the really interesting documentaries. Good idea. But I don't know if we're going to get. I can think of 8 films on the theme of the French Resistance, but um, but but maybe so. Anyway, Anne Marie, always very good to see you. Thank you so much, Anne Marie, for your generosity. As I always say, Anne Marie is our resident musical expert, musical scholar, who is an eminent musician, plays in the finest orchestras in the world, associated with the finest composers and conductors and artists of the 20th and 21st centuries, and by extraordinary good fortune, allows us to enjoy, musical scholarship from somebody who's, is on the inside, somebody who plays, music at this high level of orchestra concert level. And so, it's always a real delight for us whenever she makes a musical contributions. I post something on the music club every week, and it's always such a thrill for me when Anne Marie then posts her comments or criticisms. She often criticizes some of the musical works that I choose, but I always learn so much from her comments. So it's a real honor for us to have her in the Gaggle community. And I think, as I said last time, I posted Sibelius's Third Symphony. So I'm hoping that Anne Marie will have the time at some point just to say something about that work. It's because in my own personal view, I think it's his greatest symphony. So really excited to learn what Anne Marie thinks of it. So anyway, but Anne Marie, as always, thank you for your contributions. And in every way to the Gaggle community. Cynthia, nice to see you again, Cynthia. Cynthia is, of course, our film expert. Been away for a week or so, but always has interesting and illuminating comments about our film screenings, and always lends us her film scholarship and her knowledge of cinema history, and also her astute aesthetic judgments about the films that we show. So it's always a great pleasure for us to have Cynthia on hand to explain to us the history of the films that we show, and whatever flaws or whatever that were in the making of the film. So it's always great for us to have Cynthia. Anyway, so thank you so much. And Cynthia says, evidently, Dr. Gilbert Doctorow, yes, has gone so far as to claim that a palace revolution is imminent in the Kremlin in Moscow, and that Russian society increasingly views Vladimir Putin as a hated Gorbachev 2.0. See links below in the next comment. He also makes some crass suggestions for a successor to the Russian president, whose government ship has now accumulated too much barnacle growth and become too cumbersome. Agree or disagree, George? Well, it's a very interesting because I listened to that podcast. He was on with Napolitano, and where he outlined this argument of his. And to be honest, Napolitano pressed him. He says, "Well, where are you hearing all of this? Who's saying this? That that Trump is that not Trump, Putin is likely to be replaced." And Dr. O kind of backed away, and he couldn't really. Oh well, I just hear these things. It's in the grapevine, and people say things, and it's in the air. And so, he said these one metaphor after another, but he couldn't really name just one person. Is there anyone because Dr. O's whole shtick is that he watches Russian TV. And in particular, he watches the Soloviev show, and I think he watches some of the other 60 Minutes, which I think is a more vulgar version of Soloviev. And so, now maybe somebody on one of those shows, some of them get quite angry and frustrated, had said that, suggested that Putin needs to be replaced or whatever. I have my doubts, because Soloviev is, I think, quite close to Putin, and I doubt whether he would tolerate for very long anybody on his show who talked along those lines. Now, so my feeling when I listened to that interview with Dr. O was that that was more wishful thinking on Dr. O's part. I think Dr. O feels frustrated, as I think we all do, with Russia's progress in this war. Like as I said, I think it's going very slowly, and the reason why I have said, the people here say, oh well, yeah, but this is a war of attrition, and Russia will win this war. Russia has the resources. Ultimately, this attrition war will destroy NATO and Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And I've always been unpersuaded by that argument. First of all, I think NATO has huge, if it so desires, it has huge resources at its disposal. So if it decides to mobilize its resources, I'm not at all sure Russia can win that. But let's say NATO doesn't mobilize its resources. A war of attrition could go on for a long time, and if a war goes on for a long time, you never know how it's going to go. There's always the danger. Look at all the just during the last 7 days, all the dramatic changes that we've experienced, and who knows what other dramatic changes could happen. You never know with Trump. You never know who's going to come after Trump, because at this rate, since none of the people are saying, "Oh, everything is going fantastically well," none of them can then present us with a timeline. All right, you think it's going really well for Russia. So when do you expect this war to come to an end? When is this war of attrition going to yield fruitful results for Russia? Well, they don't have a timeline. So this war's now, soon it'll be 4 years that this war has been going on. Well, how do we know it's not going to go on for another 4 years? And then what happens after those 4 years? NATO will have been growing stronger and stronger and stronger, and then NATO itself may be preparing for a preemptive war of its own against Russia, a weakened Russia. A Russia after 8 years of war will be sufficiently weakened, and NATO could then think that it has a shot at defeating Russia. These are all unknowns, and that's the problem. That war is, it's an unknown quantity. Anything can happen, and that's why if you get a war, you got to get it done, over with, finished as soon as you can. The longer it drags on, the more unpredictable it is, the more dangerous it is, and the more greater likelihood that you're going to be led into a disaster. As this war goes on, I think we're heading towards serious escalations, and when you have serious escalation, you have no idea how that's going to fare. So that's my view, and I think probably Dr. O shares that view. What I'm not sure about is that there are really serious moves behind the scenes to remove Putin. I mean, maybe there are, but I haven't seen any evidence of it, and Dr. O didn't provide any evidence to Napolitano. So that's why I thought, well, maybe it's just wishful thinking on his part. And it sounded as if he, Dr. O, wanted to see a new, younger, more vigorous leadership taking over in Russia. And it's possible that a new, younger, more vigorous leadership will change the Putin policy and decide to pursue the war more aggressively and more decisively. Um, I mean, that's is absolutely, within the realm of possibility. I mean, after all, you have to wonder among the Russia's political and military leaders what they're thinking, and what they also are considering that, hey, this war's dragging on, and we just have no, we have no time frame as to when this is going to come to an end, and whether it's going to come to an end in any satisfactory way for us. Yeah, we have all this, the Scott Ritter and the McGregor and everyone else saying, yeah, everything is great, but the Russia's political and military leaders have to wonder, well, when is this going to come to an end? So they may well be thinking that Putin has not shown the kind of decisive leadership that's necessary. Which means decisive means you have to take risks. I mean, to win this war now, Russia would have to take risks. I mean, there's always a risk, yeah, that if it takes very decisive action against Kiev, including killing Zelensky, destroying the Zelensky and his crew, killing them all, the military command, everything, liquidating it. It carries a risk. Carries that NATO and the United States will get directly involved in the face of that. But that's probably what Russia really needs to do now. Just simply strike a knockout blow, and then present NATO with a fait accompli, and then tell them, okay, you want to get involved? Go ahead, get involved. You're not really ready to do it, and I think that's why I think that. But it requires a risk. It requires somebody who's a risk taker. Putin isn't that. I think Putin is not a wartime leader. I think Putin is very much a domestic leader. I think he's more interested, more comfortable talking about energy prices and infrastructure and domestic politics. He's not really a wartime leader. He's not a Stalin, and I think that's and I think you'd have. I think it's a very fair criticism. I'm not sure whether there's anyone waiting in the wings. It could happen. I mean, tomorrow there could be an announcement that Putin has been removed from all positions of leadership. It's happened before in Russia. You could have an announcement, and then somebody that we don't know, somebody that we've never heard of, could be installed in his place. After all, nobody knew who Putin was in 1999 when Yeltsin suddenly appointed him prime minister, and then a few months later, Yeltsin resigned. Who the hell was Putin? So they, could well be somebody in the wings. So I think it's an interesting thesis, but I don't see any evidence of it. And I would certainly think that that's an probably that's Russia does need someone with a fresh perspective, fresh pair of hands, somebody who is I think who would show kind of more energy and decisiveness than Putin has showed. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia, for that question. And then here are the links. Thank you. And then, anyway, Cynthia then goes on. And then, as expected, Dr. O received a lot of criticism for that, some even describing it as alarmist scaremongering. Yeah, I would imagine he received that kind of criticism. But I don't know whether, yeah, I mean, I'm sure the alarmist scaremongering. I think my point was just simply, it sounds to me like wishful thinking. I think that's what Dr. O would like to see, but I don't know that anybody has weighed in and that saying we need a change in leadership, and that as long as Putin is there, we will never win this war. I mean that as I say, I think that may be how Dr. O thinks. It's how Paul Craig Roberts thinks. But I don't know whether anyone in the Russian leadership thinks, and of course, even if there are people in the Russian leadership who think that, it's one thing to think it. another thing to carry out a coup. To carry out a coup, you have to really get all your ducks in a row. You have to be really very well organized, very uh, very ruthless, and everybody has to be on board. The entire military, security, leadership have to be on board. There can't be any dissenters. And we've seen in the recent past that certain coups do not succeed. The coup against Gorbachev did not succeed in August 18th of 1991. Now, who knows? Maybe if that coup had succeeded, the Soviet Union might have been saved. I don't know. I mean, by then maybe it was already too late. But nonetheless, that coup failed. The coup plotters had no idea how to organize a coup. They just didn't know how to do it. So you got to have really people, who know exactly all the things you need to do in order to pull off a coup. Everybody has to be all the military, all the security, um, all of the rich oligarchs, everyone within the political insiders all have to be on board. You have to control the media. You can't have this media outlet not supporting a coup and so on. So it's got to be very well planned, which of course makes it very difficult to pull off generally, because then somebody is going to be an informer and betray the whole plot. So difficult to pull off. Not impossible, but difficult to pull off. They didn't do it against Gorbachev, and therefore they didn't save the Soviet Union. The coup, on the other hand, against Yeltsin was successful, probably because Yeltsin was obviously so completely out of it. I mean, so manifestly incompetent, manifestly incapable of performing his duties, that I think everybody agreed that Yeltsin needed to be replaced. Putin doesn't give that impression. He seems, as I say, I think his wartime leadership leaves a lot to be desired, but he seems competent. There's no sign of any kind of any senility or mental imbalance or anything like that. So that would work in his favor. Anyway, so here's how he responded to such criticism. Quote, "We are headed into World War III any which way. If Putin continues to show restraint, such as his latest ass licking to Trump, he will be deposed, replaced by Russia's war hoax, and there we go. If he does not show his teeth in Trump right now, we are all doomed." Well, I agree with that analysis. I mean, I think that what Putin's manifest failures are precisely that he has shown himself as weak and indecisive. And by showing himself to be weak and indecisive, he has encouraged NATO, he has encouraged Trump. Because they think, well, Putin is weak and decisive. Russia is a paper tiger, as Trump has said. And that, I think, is the danger of keeping Putin around. He talks big, just as yesterday he again talked very big. Well, if they go down this path of using these long range missiles, boy, they're gonna really feel it. Yeah, but you've made these threats many times before. One threat after another, and nothing followed. And that has only served to encourage NATO to take more and more risks. And Trump is taking risks. I mean, I believe the Wall Street Journal story. I think he has signed off on Ukraine using these long range missiles or medium range missiles to hit targets deep inside Russia, because nobody is afraid of Russia. Nobody, because they can see that Putin does not want to extend the war beyond Ukraine's borders. Well, as long as he doesn't want to extend the war beyond Ukraine's borders, then of course it's a freebie for NATO, because they can say, well, we can do whatever we like to Russia. We can hit Russia wherever we like. And the only response we get from Russia is that it keeps hitting Ukraine. It never hits us. So why wouldn't we do it? It's a freebie. Yeah, absolutely. Let's send this, and let's help Ukraine target this or that facility, because Russia's never going to hit us. So until Russia readies itself to hit certainly in the first instance European NATO member states, until Russia does that, then NATO is going to keep provoking Russia, because they think Russia's afraid of us. And that I think is the danger of keeping on Putin. And then because then if you've got a new leader, then yeah, absolutely, you could have a Russia then saying, well, I think we need to hit targets outside of Ukraine. In the first place, we can't allow war material to be transported across Poland or across Romania into Ukraine. We just can't allow them to do it. And we got to raise the costs to them. But Putin isn't willing to do that. NATO can see that Putin isn't willing to do that, and so NATO continues with its provocative actions. Because there's no cost to NATO. There's no all the costs are borne by Russia and Ukraine. So it's a freebie for NATO. So as long as Putin is there, I think this war is unwinnable for Russia. I mean, that's basically it. I think it's just this. They're going to keep arming Ukraine, and yeah, at some point Ukraine will run out of manpower. That I think that's probably true. Mathematically, I think that's true, but that might happen years and years down the road. It's not going to happen by Christmas. So I think that's neat, right? Anyway, so that's anyway. Cynthia then goes on. Here's the link to the above quote from Dr. Rowe. Yeah, and then anyway. Then Cynthia goes on. Remember, Rand Paul and Thomas Massey also supported Trump. Everyone sees how he treats them now. It's very interesting about Rand Paul and Thomas Massey, because they are both libertarians. I mean, they're not exactly MAGA, they're not exactly Trumpians, but they are libertarians, which means that they are part of the Trumpian coalition. Because if you think of what do Rand Paul and Thomas Massey stand for? Obviously, non-intervention against endless wars. They also stand for free speech. There should be no censorship on the internet. And since Trump himself had been the victim of internet censorship, I mean, God, he lost all his accounts, Facebook, Twitter. Everyone took down his accounts. So he was the victim of big tech censorship. So Rand Paul and Thomas Massey are against all of that. Rand Paul and Thomas Massey were against the whole COVID hysteria and all the government repression that was introduced at the time of COVID. So they're absolutely part of the movement, key figures in the movement that brought Trump back to power in 2024. That's where that's important. So they're part of the coalition. So even if they're not exactly Trump followers, they're not Trumpians, they're not MAGA, they are key figures within the Trumpian coalition. You absolutely need them on board, because they speak for that libertarian um, movement that came out and supported Trump. You know, the libertarians were very wary of Trump. They didn't think he was really, he's truly a libertarian, but they said, okay, Trump now shows that he's against government repression, he's against government censorship, he's against the sort of overmighty state, he's against wars, he's against foreign interventions. That he's somebody that we can get behind. So now what he's doing, he's going against Rand Paul and Thomas Massey, particularly Massey. That he's determined to remove Massey from Congress, and there's a lot of money is being poured in against Massey. So that's really very disturbing because Massey is, I think he's a man of principle. I think he's very honorable. I think he's a genuine libertarian. As I say, the kind of libertarianism that Trump embraced during his campaign last year, and now he's determined to remove him from Congress. And Trump is raising money for the loathsome Lindsey Graham, loathsome Lindsey, Lady Lindsey. Lindsey Graham has nothing to do with MAGA. He has nothing to do with America First. He has nothing to do with non-interventionism. He has nothing to do with any kind of restraints on governmental powers. He is, the champion of governmental repression. And there is Trump raising funds for Lindsey Graham while he's constantly bad mouthing Rand Paul and while he's campaigning against Thomas Massey. It's it's not a good look. Not at all a good look. If you're a politician, you need to at least maintain your coalition. You don't have to particularly like everybody, but you have to at least maintain your coalition. If you don't have time for the libertarians within your coalition, then I think your coalition is going to be more and more dominated by the neocons, which is what is now happening. He's pursuing policies. This policy against Russia smacks of Lindsey, of Lady Lindsey. This is Lindsey Graham policy. It's Kaya Kallas policy, but it's also Lindsey Graham policy. It's certainly not the kind of policy that he ran on, and the kind of policy that inspired libertarians to come to his aid. So anyway, Cynthia Lane goes on. Now that the Europeans are buying U.S.-made weapons to supply to Ukraine, the U.S. is making money out of a continuing war. Ending the war would end this income. I think that's true. I don't think it's all about making money on weaponry, because America would be spending money on weaponry whether this war in Ukraine continued or not. I mean, we've seen the one budget that never seems to decrease is the Pentagon budget. So that would continue without this war. The war against Russia it's a deep state project. It's a NATO project. It's the transatlantic alliance project. And Trump has not shown himself to be decisive enough or committed enough to challenge this consensus. And he's just simply going along with it. He's made a few vague, superficial gestures to try to bring this war to an end, but he's never been intellectually committed to it. And essentially, he is now being co-opted by this war lobby, deep state, and whatever. Yeah, as I say, he may turn around next week and suddenly say, "Oh, I think Vladimir and I should have a meeting," but it's none of it, it's just going to be as superficial as last week's suggestion of a meeting in Budapest. Just yet another photo op, but without really any substance. And when we read out Putin's comments today, he said a meeting only makes sense if it's well prepared. If you actually go in and have detailed agreements that you're ready to sign. Just having a pointless photo op, we're not interested in a meeting like that. And I just don't know whether. And I think that became clear probably during the phone conversation between Lavrov and Rubio, but namely that Russia's not changing its position. We want to talk about something substantive and not just a pointless photo op in Budapest. Anyway, thank you, Cynthia. And then we have Aristotle 1. Thank you, Aristotle. And then Aristotle asks, when did you realize that the war in Serbia was a new model for liberal interventionism as opposed to just being Western opportunism? Did you appreciate the ugly American neocon strategy at the time? Did you have a particular interest in interest in Serbia before the war? So no, I had no particular interest in Yugoslavia before the war. I mean, I didn't find Yugoslavia a particularly interesting subject. Um, and so initially, when the war started, because I didn't really know that much about it, I kind of blandly assumed that the accounts were right. Oh, these horrible Serbs were picking on these Croats who were yearning for freedom from Yugoslavia. So initially, at least, I thought, okay, well, that maybe that's right. Um, but then it occurred to me that this story doesn't make a great deal of sense, and I thought, well, it seems like the Serbs are being quite reasonable. They seem to be supporting all sorts of peace plans, and the people who are rejecting the peace plans are the Croats and Muslims, and of course their sponsors. You know, the Germans in the case of the Croats, and of course the Americans in the case of the Muslims. And then it sort of really began to dawn on me that this whole Yugoslavia operation was really conceived as a way to make NATO relevant, because basically in 1990, 1991, when this war started, was the time that most people were assuming, well, this is the end of NATO. I mean, the Warsaw Pact has gone. There's no longer any Soviet occupation in Eastern Europe. So what do we need NATO for? And therefore, NATO had to do some very fancy thinking as to how to justify their continued existence. And this is what Yugoslavia provided them with an opportunity. And they did it by suggesting that it was a kind of humanitarian intervention, and that these Serbs were these monsters, and that with Croats, Muslims, Kosovo Albanians, they all had to be rescued by the knights in shining armor, namely NATO. And then I knew then this whole thing is a crock. That's just not the way life is. That's just not the way history is. And then I began researching more and more on this, and that no, this whole thing, the destruction of Yugoslavia, and then the punishment of the one group of people who opposed the destruction of Yugoslavia, the one group of people who suffered the most as a result of the destruction of Yugoslavia, the Serbs, because now they were just broken up into innumerable little states. They had to be punished. NATO had to punish them for opposing the destruction of Yugoslavia that NATO itself had secured. And so, yeah, this was then the template for the neocon liberal interventionist wars of the future, in which you destroy countries, you create chaos, and then you can pose as the rescuer, the savior. Oh, look, these terrible things are going on. You know, there's chaos. There's people are suffering. People are getting hurt. We have to come in and save everybody. It was a deeply dishonest exercise, but this model was absolutely used in a certain way in Iraq. Oh, we have to save, name whoever you want to save. Oh, we have to save the Kurds from the horrible Saddam Hussein, and having created again the chaos as a consequence of these brutal sanctions against Saddam Hussein and the constant bombing of Iraq during the 90s. Oh, Iraq is a terrible, it's a basket case. We have to go in and save the Iraqis. I mean, yeah, there was the whole weapons of mass destruction argument, but that wasn't so important. We have to save the Iraqis. And of course, that was used in the case of Libya, and then of course it was used in the case of Ukraine, where again, NATO, EU moved in, destroyed a country, and then they have to, help this country, and we have to save the people whose state we had just destroyed. So that that's roughly speaking. I thought that's why Yugoslavia was really the exemplar that was to be followed time and time again by the Western powers, and always deceitfully, always in cahoots with the media, which are ready to spread lies about these countries. Um, and then, Aristotle asks, have you seen the Gallup poll showing the 69% of Ukrainians want immediate peace? Does anyone care what they think, or are they just cannon fodder to be spent and their homes taken and redeveloped by oligarchs? Well, I mean, I think you saw that question that was asked by that journalist during that White House presser. He asked precisely about this Gallup poll, and said, how can you justify your great concern for Ukrainians? Oh, you have to send arms to Ukraine, when it's, this very poll shows that Ukrainians want peace. They don't want this war to go on. It's you, the people who are sending these arms, you want this war to go on. And you justify what you're doing. Oh, you're doing it for the Ukrainians. But here's this poll that shows that that's not what the Ukrainians want. They want this war to end. As any rational, sensible person would want this war to end. But here's Rutte. Oh, yeah, we're going to send more arms. There's, Ursula von der Leyen, Kaya Kalas. Yeah, we're going to send more arms. Irrespective of whether the Ukrainians want this or not, because that's what Zelensky is demanding. But Zelensky is their creature. He's the creature of NATO. Zelensky is no longer has no legitimacy whatsoever. He has canceled his elections. And the media can, during martial law, don't have, and there's no need for elections. He has now been in power for more than 6 years. So, 96 years. So, soon it'll be 7 years that he will have been in power. No elections. There's no question of having any election. And the media and NATO continue justifying, this is democracy, even though they have no elections there. And to send arms to him, even though the people want peace, but they don't get a look in because there are no elections. He's canceled the elections. Or having canceled the election. And this is, of course, standard practice in the EU and in NATO. We talked many times about what went on in Romania, um, Moldova, and so on. We don't want any stinking elections because then our our position might be challenged. So we got to go on sending arms to Ukraine, even though ordinary Ukrainians do not want this. So yeah, that's right. And of course, Rote had no answer to this question. Trump had no answer to this question. Rote just babbled on, saying, "Oh well, the more weapons we send, the faster we get to peace." This garbage that NATO has been spewing for years and years. The more weapons, the faster we get to peace. And then Trump just sort of rambled on about his, well, it wouldn't have happened if I'd been president and so on. So yeah, it's you're absolutely right. Does anyone care what they think? Nope. NATO certainly does not. Or are they just cannon fodder to be spent and their homes taken and redeveloped by oligarchs? Yeah, yeah, that's about it. So thank you, Aristotle, for your questions. And then Anne Marie says, I will try to deliver a valid comment on Sibelius. I commented on Williams and Stravinsky. And I actually wonder what you think of that. Okay, yep, I will address that. But I mean, if you have time to comment on Sibelius. But as always, Anne-Marie, thank you very much for your contributions. That's really appreciated. It's a great honor for us to have that. Robert, New Jersey's property tax, the highest in the nation, yep, is the major campaign issue. The dragon everyone promises to slay. Chattarelli flashes the sword of cuts. Cheryl blathers on about reform. The likely outcome is the dragon lives and Cheryl squeaks by. That's kind of the way it is. Yeah, property tax in New Jersey, and there used to be the auto insurance. I mean, I remember it's always auto insurance, which is the big issue in New Jersey. And then Amory says, but Trump went after Julian Assange. How can he be for free speech and against censorship? Very good question. Very, very good question. And Trump very skillfully got himself out of that issue because he kind of, it seemed like, well, I didn't really have anything to do with that. That was just Bill Barr at the Justice Department. And then he was asked, I think it was during, I think either his exit interview or shortly after the end of his presidency in 2021, he was asked by Candace Owens, why didn't you give a pardon to Julian Assange? And then Trump said, well, I was thinking about it, and then I had to weigh it. It was very difficult. I wasn't sure, and he kind of hemmed and hawed, but nonetheless, he suggested that this was something that he had really, really thought about. This is something that he was really considering. So therefore, people took that comment as if, well, Trump is basically on our side. Look, he was seriously thinking about pardoning Julian Assange, but he didn't pardon him. Now, Biden didn't pardon him either. And they just came up with this complicated maneuver whereby he would be released. He would plead guilty to something in a court, make sure he wasn't extradited to the United States. So he never got a pardon. But Trump somehow persuaded people that really secretly, deep down, he sympathized with Julian Assange. And that's how Trump has always operated. And he's somehow persuades people that, well, that's not really what his policies aren't really what he actually thinks. Even now, as I said, I mean, he imposes sanctions on Russia, but nonetheless he sends out a truth as if this is a policy of the Treasury Department, not his policy. So he sends out a press release from the Treasury. So it has all the Treasury logo, as if, well, that's them, that's not me. So he plays this game, and so yeah, he's been quite skillful at it. Now, when you say how can he be for free speech and against censorship, well, he's not. But people thought that he might be because he had suffered so obviously as a result of censorship, the censorship that was introduced by big tech in collusion with the Democrats. I mean, they really hit him. They by throwing him off the social media, and then of course they prosecuted him, and number of those charges, particularly the one about January the 6th, involved his rights to free speech. So they thought, well, hey, you have suffered from governmental crackdown, so therefore you must be uh, a supporter of free speech. But like many people, he is only a champion of free speech when he is the victim of a crackdown on free speech. He doesn't care about other people's rights to free speech. No, it's only his right to free speech that agitates him. But others' rights to free speech, that he doesn't really concern himself with that. So that means, of course, he's not a champion of free speech. I mean, if you're going to be a champion of free speech, you have to champion free speech of everybody. People you like, people you don't like, people you disagree with, you agree with, whatever. You have to be a champion of free speech. Otherwise, you just basically just don't like it when you're the victim. And I think that's without doubt the case with Trump. And then Anne Marie says, and everything he's doing, going after pro-Palestine people, shooting down randomly all those alleged drug boats, frankly, I just don't understand how anyone can trust anything he's saying or doing. I can't believe that in the long term, that can result in anything good from people like him and those horrific people like, uh, like, oh, yeah, just lost the place. Hexeth and Rubio, etc. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think what he's doing, going against Venezuela, is just absolutely appalling. I think this is all a regime change operation directed at Maduro. They're setting the groundwork for it by, oh, we're cracking down on narco terrorism. The chief narco terrorist in the world is Maduro. So I think they're just laying the groundwork for the onslaught that's coming against Venezuela. And I think the groundwork is these attacks on, no evidence at all that they're killing any drug traffickers. I mean, for all we know, everyone that he's killed is simply a fisherman. They're just shooting up fishing boats. But I think they're laying the groundwork for regime change, which again isn't what Trump promised when he was running for office. No more regime change, no more color revolutions, no more endless wars. Yeah, absolutely gone back on all of that. But yeah, so I mean, there's no justification whatsoever in just shooting up boats without any attempt at due process. Just simply saying, "Oh, these are drug traffickers." How the hell do you know they're drug traffickers? You just shoot somebody and say, "Oh, well, he's a drug trafficker." Uh, so and yeah, and you're right about the pro Palestine people. So yeah, I mean that you'd have to say Trump is basically, he has no commitment to free speech. He doesn't like it when his right to free speech is messed with, but he doesn't care about anyone else's free speech rights, which is why he doesn't like Rand Paul and Thomas Massey. And then Cynthia says, Trump also did not condemn the attack on the Hungary refinery. What do you think of that? He hasn't said that, and he hasn't commented at all on that, and he hasn't commented about his good friend Orban being the victim of threats Radek Sikorsky clearly is threatening, obviously threatening more attacks on Hungarian energy infrastructure. I mean, this is after the attack on this oil refinery in Hungary. Um, you know, Sikorsky clearly said, "Hey, there's an easy solution for you, Hungary, which is, stop importing Russian oil, get your oil from via Croatia." So that was a clear threat from Poland, and that means from the EU, from NATO, that if Hungary persists in its policy, there are going to be a lot more of these explosions and fires. It was an extraordinary threat, but in conformity with everything, with Sikorsky's justifying the destruction of Nord Stream. Remember, he justified it back in 2022 when he sent out that tweet rather, thank you, America. Now he's justifying it and says, oh, it's the Ukrainians. Ukrainians were acting in self-defense. So he justified terrorism a second time. And now he's essentially justifying terrorism by saying Hungary needs to stop importing oil from Russia. And therefore, as long as he does that, all sorts of unpleasant accidents will happen. That's terrorism. What Poland is engaging in terrorism. And Trump has not said anything, particularly as Victor is supposedly his good friend. So yeah, and his whole policy that everyone's got to stop importing oil from Russia is obviously hurting Hungary most of all. Hungary cannot afford to get its oil from elsewhere, and so no real help there for his good friend Victor from Trump. And then Amber, says, the fact is now the Pentagon, I think, is now the War Department is very revealing. It's revealing. On the other hand, you have to say that it's actually quite honest that they stopped calling it the Department of Defense. I mean, in what way does the Pentagon, in any way, shape, or form, in what way does the Pentagon have anything to do with defending America? They're not defending. America's not under any kind of attack. No one would dare to attack America. So the Department of Defense does nothing about defense. They're not doing any defending. It's what is it engaged in? It's engaged in war. That's what it's doing. It's war. It's engaging in war. And so there's at least Trump, in changing the Defense Department to the War Department, at least he's making it honest. I think there's honesty in advertising. Yeah, that's what we do. We wage war. And we're going to wage war, I think, primarily now against Venezuela. I think they've got Maduro in their sights. Maduro knows that they have him in their sights, which is why he's desperately trying to placate Trump. I don't think that's going to help him. I think they're determined to get him out. So I think that's going to really escalate seriously against Venezuela. And now we can see Trump seems to be escalating in Ukraine. So War Department is an absolutely appropriate description. Anyway, thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Really appreciate your comments and contributions. I think my time is up, so thank you so much, everybody who joined me, everybody who made so many interesting comments and observations. And then Anne-Marie says, agree, the masks are falling everywhere. The masks are falling everywhere, and they don't look very nice. And the worst of all is the smarmy, smug, disgusting, deceitful mask worn by NATO. And all their secretary generals, whether it's Mark Rutte or Stoltenberg, they all ooze the slimy dishonesty. We are interested in peace. We want peace. We want to get as much peace as quickly as possible. Ugh. Anyway, thank you, everybody who joined me. Thank you for all your contributions. Thank you for contributing to the tip jar. gonna have to deal with the dogs tomorrow. That's always a real problem. Um, and we're gonna do some podcast over the weekend, and then next Monday, Peter and I will do our joint live stream, and then on Tuesday I'm going to do my solo. So hope to see all of you then. Until then, good night, bye bye. See you soon. All the best.